Welcome back, everybody. We are deep into Unit 1, The Age of Revolution. We have covered topics like the English Civil War, the Enlightenment, absolutism. In our last video, we covered the American Revolution. We talked about how it was an example of the Enlightenment, that people were going to put the ideas of people like John Locke and Montesquieu and Voltaire into actual practice. In this video, we're going to start another revolution. It's the French Revolution, and we're going to spend a great deal of time on the French Revolution compared to the American Revolution. Not that one is more important than the other, it's just you guys are more familiar with the American Revolution, and you're probably not as familiar with the French Revolution. So, we're going to get into the topic today and figure out why revolution was necessary in the first place, and then the effects. So, the causes and the effects of the French Revolution, that's our objective for today. So our first main idea says that France's pre-revolution society was divided into three unequal social classes called estates. That's a major component of what we're going to look at today. So basically we're going to start by looking at France before the revolution. Pre-revolution France. This is also known as the Ancien Regime. Ancien Regime means the old order, the old way of doing things. In other words, it refers to the social structure, the political structure, the religious structure of France. And at the top of this old order, of course, no surprise, was the king. Because this was, after all, an absolute monarchy, so that's where the king is going to go. Beneath the king would have been three social classes called estates. Now, I know when you think of the word estate, you probably think of like some big fancy house and a big piece of land or something. But again, in this context, estate simply refers to a social class. There are three of them. So let's go through them. In our first estate, we're going to look at a group called the clergy. And if you've never heard the term clergy before, it refers to the priesthood of, in this case, France. So in the very first estate, okay, the first of the three, that is where the clergy of France went. The priests and all the cardinals and bishops and all those other different ranks. This is a small group, only actually less than 1% of the population, but as a small group, they owned a lot of land, about 10% of the land that belonged to the clergy, again, who made up less than 1%. They were exempt from pretty much all taxes, so they're paying very little, if anything, into the government in the first estate. Now, if the clergy is the first estate, we have to predict, okay, who would be in the second estate. So think about who would be in there. And in the second estate, of course, is going to be your nobility, the wealthy, the powerful nobility. Like the first estate, they make up a pretty small percentage of the population, just about 2% of the people or so, but they own about 20% of the land. So again, politically and economically powerful. Now, not all the second estate were fabulously rich. They were, relatively poor and certainly indebted nobility. But being a nobleman or noblewoman came with a lot of privileges. In particular, for our topic, is the lack of taxes. As a nobleman or noblewoman, you paid no taxes. So you have some of the richest people in France paying no taxes. So we have the clergy in first estate. We've got the nobility in the second estate. Who would be in the third estate? Well, everybody else, right? Everybody else. So about 97% of the population of France would have fit into the third estate. We're going to refer to them as the commoners. So they're not a member of the clergy. They're not a nobleman or noblewoman. They are a commoner. Unlike the first and second estate, they do have to pay taxes, very high taxes. Taxes to the government, taxes in the form of tithes, to the church, dues, and to the local noble family. So every time you turn around as a member of the third estate, you're paying somebody some taxes. Now, not everyone in the third estate was poor. There was a middle class, even an upper class that was fairly wealthy, but they had to pay high taxes. This chart right here gives us a really good indication of just how economically desperate a lot of people in France were in the third estate, the bottom of the third estate. You can see by 1788 they're spending upwards of 80% of their income on bread. That does not mean that they are some sort of crazy bread lovers. Rather, bread, which was about the cheapest food you could find, still cost these people upwards of 80% of their income. So they are very economically desperate. And that's going to be important as our topic unfolds. So a quick review of the third estate. You've got the first, that's your clergy, your second, your nobles, your third, which was everybody else. That would include people like the bourgeoisie, which is a middle class group. You've got your lower class in the urban areas. You've got your peasant farmers out in the countryside. That's the social structure. And you can see, again, the makeup here, and then also the percent paid in taxes. So this is the social structure that lasted in France for centuries. That's what we call the Old Order, or Ancien Regime. What might have sparked some change? Think about what we've been talking about recently. What might have caused change in France? And right off the bat, it's the Enlightenment. Remember, most of our philosophers were French, so these French thinkers were well known, particularly among the upper class of the Third Estate. They were well educated, they had access to books, and these ideas certainly inspired them. They were also inspired by the American Revolution. The American example was a group of people rising up, replacing a government that they felt did not care about the rights with one that would. And so if you put those two together, there's a lot of people in the Third Estate who are saying, why is this old order still around? Why are we living as peasants when it's not necessary to live in poverty? So, main idea number 2 is weak leaders would not fix the major problems facing France. So clearly we have some big problems facing France as we get into the 1780s. And given all of these challenges, what kind of king would you want in charge of your country? What characteristics would you want for your king? Well, you're probably thinking of someone who's energetic, who's smart, who's decisive, someone who will take action, someone who's willing to make hard decisions and live with them. That is not who France has. France has King Louis XVI. And in times of plenty, he would have been a fine king. He would have fit the mold of most French kings. But this is not a time of plenty. This is a time of crisis. And he's a weak-minded king, indecisive, who is afraid of dealing with problems. He would just rather ignore the problems, even though, of course, they're going to get bigger. He was just not a very hands-on king. Now, if you're curious why there's a lock here, King Louis XVI, his favorite hobby was basically playing with locks. Okay, he would assemble them and disassemble them. He was fascinated by locks. I think this really sums up Louis XVI pretty well. Just kind of asleep at the switch, a guy who's not really hands-on when hands-on is needed. And to make matters worse, his wife was terribly unpopular. Her name was Queen Marie Antoinette. Now, Marie Antoinette came originally from Austria, and Austria and France were pretty big rivals. And so she was disliked for that reason, but also the fact that she spent so much money. Dresses and palaces and servants and gowns and food and you name it. She spent and spent and spent in a time when a lot of French people were going hungry. And so the resentment grew. In fact, she was so spend happy that people nicknamed her Madame Deficit. Okay, deficit is like a debt, basically. Check out Marie Antoinette in this outfit. That's enough clothing for a whole village of peasants, really. Speaking of village, and speaking of Marie Antoinette and peasants, this is something that was constructed on the palace grounds of Versailles. Remember, Versailles is this huge French palace, and on the palace grounds, she had this little village built, this little fake model village, and was there for Marie Antoinette and her rich friends to go out and play as if they're peasants. Because Marie Antoinette, all the partying and government stuff, it got kind of boring after a while. So she would like to pretend that she was a simple farmer. She'd go out and pet the sheep and play in the flowers and look at the ducks flying by or whatever. And that was her vision of what peasant life was like. And obviously, if you look at this, peasants were not living in places like this. There is Marie Antoinette dressed up like the shepherdess in a nice little home. Now, if I'm a peasant at this time period, particularly a poor peasant, I'm pretty insulted by the way Marie Antoinette is acting, because she thinks it's fun to dress up like me, even though it's not really my lifestyle. It's a fictional fantasy version of my lifestyle. All right, main idea number 3. France faced severe economic problems which helped cause the revolution. So let's get into those economic problems. And the first one is something I referenced in our very first video. We talked a little bit about Louis XIV and how under his leadership, France, the debt of France grew and grew and grew, and that would be handed down basically from king after king after king. And that's what we're looking at. The deficit, the debt of France is growing rapidly. So let's try to figure out what explained this huge debt in France. One, France fought a lot of wars. Okay, it was a country that had fought, obviously, in the French and Indian War, and then had helped out Americans in the American Revolution and all kinds of other wars around the world. So France had spent a lot on its military. The royal family also spent a lot. Think of Queen Marie Antoinette, Madame Deficit. She had spent tons on all the fancy parts of being a queen, all the fancy gowns and the big festivals and all this stuff. And so the royal family had just spent, and now the debt was threatening to crush the French people. So part of the economic crisis was man-made, overspending, fighting wars, all that stuff. But then part of it is also nature. The winter of 1788-89 was one of the worst on the record. Incredibly cold temperatures. The wheat crop in France failed. Harvests were terrible. And as a result, bread prices began to skyrocket. And remember, these are people who are really having a hard go of it, even in good times, and now facing a crisis where there's simply not enough food to go around. It's going to lead to some real problems in France. All right, main idea number 4. The French Revolution began in 1789 when the Third Estate turned on the First and Second Estates. So we've got lots of different causes of the French Revolution you can see here. And the thing is, some of these had been present in France for many, many generations. The difference is in 1789 we have all of these together. It's kind of that perfect storm effect where you have a bunch of smaller negatives, and each in their own right would not necessarily result in a disaster, but when you put them all together, it is an absolute disaster facing France. Now, we're going to apply what we're going to look at next to something a little more familiar to you and I. It has to do with a legislature of sorts for France. Now, we're going to compare that to the British legislature. The name of the British legislature, of course, is the Parliament, and the American equivalent of that would be our Congress. Now, France didn't really have anything exactly like that. Instead, it had this thing called the Estates General. And the Estates General was a representative, a body of people, members of all 3 estates were part of it, and this is something that most French kings had ignored. In fact, Louis XVI calls the Estates General into session, and it was the first time this Estates General had met in about 175 years. So the fact that he's willing to call them into session to ask for ideas to solve their economic problems tells us just how desperate things are, that he's going to do something that, again, no French king had done for many, many years. He's absolutely desperate for some sort of help. Now, the Estates General comes and goes. It doesn't solve the problems because the problems are too big by this point anyways. There is no magical solution. Instead, members of the Third Estate broke with the Estates General, and they formed something that they called the National Assembly, and they said that they're going to pass laws in the name of the French people. Now, there's no legal authority to do this. This is all completely illegal. But the Third Estate, of course, is 97% of the population. So the First and Second Estates are very much intimidated by the Third Estate. Notice how the Third Estate is reaching for weapons. He's also breaking free from his shackles. And the title is The Third Estate Awakens. And the Third Estate finally says, hey, we're 97% of the people. We deserve to have more of the power. Now, this National Assembly thing gets started And during those early days, on one of these early days, members of the National Assembly go to meet at their meeting hall, and they find themselves locked out. The doors have been locked, and they start to panic. They assume that this is some sort of royal plot by King Louis XVI, or maybe by the nobility, to try to seize their power back and try to end the National Assembly. So they panic, and they break into a neighboring tennis court, indoor tennis court. Yes, they had tennis back then. And the members here, you can see them, on the tennis court, they take an oath. We call this the tennis court oath, and the oath was, we will not leave, we will not disassemble as a group until there's a fair constitution for France. All right, so far, everything that's been done, whether it was legal or illegal, has still been relatively peaceful. That is going to end with the storming of the Bastille, and that is the beginning of the French Revolution. So what is the Bastille? Well, the Bastille was an ancient fortress turned into a prison, had been in France for hundreds of years, and by the time of the French Revolution, there weren't that many prisoners left in it, but historically, this prison had served as kind of a place where political prisoners were forced to go. It's the place where you were sent if you had been speaking out against the king, if you were seen as a troublemaker. You were kind of locked away in these dungeons, and in many cases just to rot away. So it's a symbol of royal oppression. It's a building that as you were walking the streets of Paris, you would see that building, and it was kind of this physical reminder of the king, his power, and your lack of power. So rumors start to spread that the king is going to assemble some mercenaries to come in and put down this National Assembly to kind of take the power back from the people. And the people of Paris are panicking. Okay, we've got to defend ourselves because the king's going to come with his army. What can we do? And they decided, okay, we've got to get our hands on some gunpowder. So they've been able to assemble some weapons, but they don't have any gunpowder. And they decide the best place to find that gunpowder would be at the Bastille. So on July 14th, 1789, a massive crowd arrives at the Bastille, storms the prison, and they take it over in search of those those weapons, the gunpowder, and also to free the prisoners therein. And the reason the Bastille is so important is basically pressure had been building in France for years, between the haves and the have-nots, the powerful and the powerless, and that finally comes out. It's finally unleashed, and you've got people who are not even thinking straight. They're so angry at the king. Now, if you were in Paris and you wanted to go see the Bastille today, the site of the beginning of the French Revolution, well, you would have a bit of a problem because the Bastille's not there. This is where the Bastille once stood. It's basically an intersection today. And the reason for this is the people of Paris were so angry and so anxious to weaken the king that they literally tore the Bastille down brick by brick. So there's virtually nothing left of the Bastille because people took it apart and broke it up into smaller pieces as souvenirs or just to use for, paving a sidewalk or something. The Bastille really was just completely disassembled. Now, the storming of the Bastille is important because, again, everything else before had been relatively peaceful. Now we've got an actual demonstration of violence, and the king has to respond to this. And when the king doesn't forcefully respond to it, it encourages more of this type of behavior. So this is seen as the beginning of the French Revolution. And every year, July 14th every year, the French people celebrate Bastille Day as their national holiday. It's a day to kind of be proud of being French and think about all the sacrifices that have happened before. It's kind of similar to, say, like, maybe a Memorial Day or something like that here in America. Here we are in the Arc de Triomphe, that famous landmark in the middle of Paris, and looking up, and we're seeing this beautiful tricolor, the French flag, made out of the exhaust from these jets. All right, so we covered the causes and effects of the French Revolution. Obviously, we're pretty heavy on the causes right now. The effects will will kick in more in our next lesson. But if you think back to the causes, think back to things like the unequal estates model, the three estates model. We've got tax privileges for some, high taxes for others. We had, of course, the terrible winter of 1788-89. We have a royal family that's indecisive and also spends too much. We have a situation in which people are just, frankly, fed up with the status quo.